Welcome to the 2012 Oppenheimer Lecture. This lecture was established by the IISS with the support of Nicky Oppenheimer to give an important annual platform to an African leader drawn from the worlds of politics, business, or academia to offer new perspectives on the African geopolitical and geoeconomic condition. We naturally take every opportunity to expose our global audience to the viewpoints of Africans, and we wish increasingly to devote more research efforts to the continent. Only last week, for example, we had the Prime Minister of Somalia, Dr. Abdiweli Mohammed Ali, address an audience in this room on the challenges for Somalia on the eve of the London Conference on Somalia. Last year, one of our researchers conducted field research in Ghana on the delicate issue of the international drug trade, and the results will be out in an Adelphi book very shortly. But the Oppenheimer Lecture was specifically designed to invite a broad strategic perspective on Africa's place in international affairs. And today, I'm certain that we will have just such an address. North Africa and the Maghreb have been hugely in the news this last year as the Arab Spring began in Tunisia and then migrated to Egypt and then to Libya. It is a phenomenon that is most associated with the Middle East, and yet a form of revived people power has been seen in parts of Asia, where a number of countries have taken steps to accelerate reform and modernization in anticipation of more organized protests were they to fail to adapt. There has been little analysis, though, of how the North African impulse given to the Arab Spring would affect the conduct and outcome of sub-Saharan African politics. Will the Arab Spring produce new winds of change in African political culture? To answer that question, we have the ideal speaker. Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo was born in Ghana in 1944 and educated at Lancing College, Sussex, and the University of Ghana. He was called to the English Bar, Middle Temple, in 1971, so he knows this part of London very well. He has pursued a business and legal career while fully engaged in Ghana's political life. He was Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2003 to 2007, and in that capacity served as President of the UN Security Council in 2006. Nana Akufo-Addo was the first chairperson of the Ghana Committee on Human and People's Rights. He stood for president in the 2008 presidential elections and was defeated by the narrowest of margins. He is again the candidate of the centrist New Patriotic Party for the 2012 presidential elections scheduled to be held this December. I met him in November of 2011 in Abu Dhabi at a conference organized by the UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I noticed that he listened very carefully during 2 days of deliberations, and then in the last few moments rose to give a few extemporaneous remarks on the future of democracy in Africa and the Arab Spring. I am glad that he responded positively to my then immediate request that he consider preparing a formal lecture on this theme for an ISS audience. It is therefore a real delight to welcome Mr. Akufo-Addo to deliver the 2012 Oppenheimer Lecture.
Chairperson, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored, and dare I say it, highly delighted to have been invited to give this year Oppenheimer Lecture at this prestigious body, the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And I'm particularly grateful to the Director General, our chairperson, Dr. John Shipman, for that. The honor and delight have, however, been somewhat undermined by a nagging anxiety about my ability to follow successfully in the footsteps of the eminent Africans who have preceded me on this podium. Nicky Oppenheimer, the chairman of De Beers, one of Africa's great business concerns, who initiated this lecture series. President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Africa's first elected female head of state, who has recently won re-election, an acknowledgement by the Liberian people of the critical work that she's doing in promoting national reconciliation and progress in post-conflict Liberia. Trevor Nkubi, a very prominent figure on the African media landscape, and President Paul Kagame, the redoubtable leader of Rwanda leader who, like his Liberian counterpart, is fully engaged in the difficult process of national reconciliation and reconstruction of post-conflict Rwanda. Any deficiencies in the quality of my presentation from those of this illustrious cast can be put down to the fact that I am a mere opposition leader. I've chosen to speak on the topic, the future of democracy in Africa and the Arab Spring, for two reasons. The first is that my country, Ghana, is one that clearly is determined to walk the path of democratic empowerment after earlier years of turbulent, unstable, authoritarian rule. An important milestone in that journey will be passed this year, which is an election year in Ghana. As one who will be a significant player in that process, this occasion gives me the opportunity to stand back from the narrow confines of my own country and look at the wider connotations of the democracy project in Africa on a broader continental perspective. Secondly, the impact of the so-called Arab Spring on the development of democracy in Africa has been dramatic, a phenomenon that can only be strengthened in the years ahead. There are many development challenges ahead of Africa. The World Bank rightly identifies these as undiversified production structures, huge infrastructural deficits, underdeveloped human capital, weak governance, fragile states, and a need for women and youth empowerment. The road ahead for all of us in Africa, North and South, will continue to be one of tough choices, choices that present as many opportunities as challenges. Outside of Asia, Africa has the fastest growing middle class. The world's fastest growing economies in the first decade of this century have been in sub-Saharan Africa, leading the reputable journal The Economist to call the continent, quote, the surprising success story of the past decade, unquote, and project that over the next 5 years, the average African economy will outpace its Asian counterpart. In May 2000, the cover of the same Economist had called Africa, quote, a hopeless continent. That is the significance of the change of the last decade. Events last year in both North and South have made one choice very clear. The democratic path has become the preferred option of governance for Africans, one that can guide us to deliver the future our people demand. Africans are taking two important lessons from the global economic crisis. One, a strong recognition that the state is an indispensable agent of social and economic development. And two, that the market economy is worth saving and promoting. The spread of democracy in the last 20 years in Africa has been dramatic, with 2011 a year of reaffirmation, as the year of the Arab Spring also saw elections in some 27 nations in Africa. It marked the beginning of the end of 50 years of post-independence struggle for democracy. The promise of the independence movement, that freedom would rapidly improve the quality of life for independent African peoples, was quickly and cruelly subverted by decades of authoritarian rule in post-colonial Africa. In 1947, The founders of the liberal democratic tradition from which my party, the New Democratic Party, the New Patriotic Party, has emerged, were the same people who gathered in Salt Pond on that seminal date of 4th August to initiate the struggle for freedom and national independence. They believed at the outset of the Cold War that the principles of democratic accountability, respect for the rule of law and human rights, individual liberty and responsibility, and a strong market economy with good management of public finances would provide the most effective base for African development. The motto of our party became, and I quote, development in freedom, and unquote. And I believe these words have come to have a far deeper meaning across our continent. By the 1960s, all of the North African states had gained independence, and by 1966, with Ghana in the lead, all but 6 sub-Saharan African countries had as well. That same year, there were 8 military coups in Africa, including one that overthrew Ghana's first president, the world-famous Kwame Nkrumah. 3 straight decades of decline did not tell a bright story of the short history of independent Africa. The 1980s saw only 5 African countries holding competitive elections. Dictatorship and suppression of individual freedoms were apologized for as a necessary trade-off for development, despite the era of authoritarian rule being Africa's worst period of economic decline, instability, and insecurity. But Africa was quick to learn from global trends. In 1970, the number of electoral democracies globally was about 45. This has now increased threefold, and Africa alone is responsible for a third of this increase. I believe the same innate capacity must be translated into the most important African project of the 21st century, the social and economic transformation of the continent. African leaders must help build societies of opportunities that meet the aspirations of our 1 billion people. The dearth of inclusiveness and opportunities for the youth will sink African democracy unless we can end, quote, jobless growth driven by extractive industries and raw material exports. The urgent task ahead is captured in the words of Mutuli Ncube, Chief Economist and Vice President of the African Development Bank. And I quote, Africa is growing, but there are risks. Urgent attention is needed to foster inclusive growth, to improve political accountability, and to address the youth bulge, unquote. As one writer put it, the revolutions in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya were not created by accident, but the direct consequence of deep social transformations that, hopefully, are irreversible. The transformation is led by the youth population, who have grown up believing that freedom can lead to greater prosperity. Mohamed Bouazizi, the young man who set himself alight and triggered the Arab Spring, did so because the Tunisian system had long failed to give him and his generation the freedom and opportunity to pursue the prosperity that they desired. Autocracy placed an unsustainable check on the spread of opportunities. The angst and frustration that propelled the protests in the Arab world, in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, in Syria and Yemen, resonate deeply with many Africans. It is a shared sense of arrested opportunities. The young, hungry generation, with a global perspective on opportunities and the aspirations to match, expect their leaders to help deliver social and economic transformation that will have a meaningful impact on their lives. And they have new tools to achieve their goals, with the continent having the second largest number of mobile phone users in the world. The political space in most of sub-Saharan Africa has been opening up, especially since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it was only a matter of time before it crossed the Sahara. The Sahara has always been seen as a dividing line on our continent between religions, ethnicities, ideologies, cultures. But I believe that these distinctions will finally break down over the 21st century as Arab nations persevere to come to terms with the same choices other African nations have been making for the last 2 decades. It is time that the North-South divide in Africa forever becomes just sand and not a mental divide. Sub-Saharan Africa has valuable lessons learned to offer North Africa and vice versa. The challenge for the whole of Africa in the 21st century is to use the space of democracy to facilitate social and economic transformation. Providing economic opportunity for our people is our most critical task. Despite different starting points, we face similar challenges to transform our economies, and nearly half of the expected global population growth over the next 4 decades will happen in Africa. This is a daunting statistic that should nevertheless excite African leaders to rise to the challenge. It should motivate us to be bold in investing in education and in training. The Arab Spring has reminded us that democracy will rise because it has the capacity to respond to the innate human instincts for freedom and for the ability to determine the direction of people's own lives. Progress across North Africa is still uneven, with some very new governments and some very old ones looking for answers to satisfy their people. In sub-Saharan Africa, Ghana's example as a stable democracy with a vibrant economy has pulled the region along, and we believe this same catalytic effect can happen in the North. The power of seeing firsthand the dividends of democracy cannot be overrated. But whether in Europe or Africa, Asia or the Americas, democracy must find its own course. The current new wave of democracy in the Arab world will no doubt add its own rich contribution to our understanding of democracies, and we should be patient as this quest to define a new identity plays out. But I think it is important for us all to remember that Islam is no more incompatible with democracy than African values were supposed to be. Democracy will be successful where it enjoys domestic ownership and leadership that is responsive to the people. Alfred Stepan and Graham Robertson compared 16 Muslim-majority countries that are predominantly Arab with 29 other Muslim-majority countries and documented that the democracy deficit that Arab societies face is Arab much more than it is Muslim. Non-Arab states have shown success in offering reasonably inclusive and democratic political rights to their citizens. So I am not on the side of those who fear that the Arab Spring will end by empowering fundamentalists through elections. Indeed, many Arab leaders use the pervasive fear of radical Islam as the alternative waiting just off stage as the excuse to bait the rest of the world to continue to support their authoritarian tendencies. I believe we would all be better served by helping Islamic political parties learn that they must deliver or face tough elections rather than telling them there is some characteristic in their ideology that will prevent them from succeeding. African governments, post-Soviet ones, and Latin American ones all went through this same learning curve. In fact, it was only recently, relatively recently, that Europe's own democratic landscape was dominated by clerical parties. Indeed, the Christian Democratic Union, CDU, continues to dominate Germany's democracy. Perhaps we should remind ourselves that the Quran makes it obligatory for leaders to consult their followers in the affairs of state. If democracy is about giving people a voice in matters of state, then the democracy is not alien to Islamic beliefs. The success of the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party in Egypt or the Ennahda Party in Tunisia should not be determined by how they use religion in the affairs of state, but how successfully they address their economic issues and the desires of the Egyptian and Tunisian people to have a say in their future. We all have a duty to support them through this transition. But the Arab populations of North Africa must also help themselves. Race, geography, and history have conspired to make African Arabs a people with several heritages. They look north, south, and east for answers to their identity and interest. Where are their long-term geopolitical interests? Do they look eastwards towards Mesopotamia and the Middle East? Do they look north towards the Mediterranean and Europe? Do they look south across the Sahara to the rest of Africa? These are the critical decisions that they are going to have to make. The period of passive citizenship in Africa has hopefully come to an end, and governments have begun to adapt. Africa's young and enthusiastic Facebook generation has no time for non-performing leaders. The good news is that they have accepted the wisdom in expressing their impatience through the ballot box. In Ghana, for example, Afrobarometer polls have shown that 90% believe the leaders should be chosen through regular, open, and honest elections. The key challenge now is ensuring that democratic freedoms can develop opportunities and prosperity to Africa's long-suffering peoples. Whether you look north or south, east or west, the currency of Africa's challenges and opportunities is virtually the same. We are societies that present limited opportunities for the mass of our people. What Africa needs above all is value addition. And this starts with adding value to our human capital through an education system that provides every child with the skills to realize their full potential. Africa needs a confident, educated workforce to be able to compete effectively in the global economy. And that is why, for my part, I've made education the foundation of my vision to build a knowledge-based, industrialized economy in Ghana. Access to free, quality, basic, universal education is our key to effective participation in the new global economy. Our human potential has not yet been developed to match and capitalize on our continent's rich resources. Until we bridge this gap, we are squandering opportunities that could move us forever away from a culture of handouts to a culture of handouts and the creation of dignified and confident societies. What is the way forward? I suggest 6 steps. We need, firstly, to enhance transparency and accountability in our government structures and build strong institutions that can fight corruption. We need to expand rapidly our infrastructure on value for money basis. We need to invest heavily in our human capital. We need to transform stagnant, jobless economies built on the export of raw materials and unrefined goods to value-added economies that provide jobs to build strong middle-class societies. We need to make a commercial from traveling to Asia or Europe to buy finished products for our local markets, to acquiring knowledge, tools, and inputs that will enable us to produce our own finished products. And we need to create an environment to encourage talents that have gone overseas or have been nurtured overseas to be brought to bear to facilitate this transformation. Africa's leaders need to address the structure of our economies in order to meet the aspirations of Africans. The economies are essentially unchanged since the colonial days. For example, last year in 2011, Ghana became an oil-producing country and recorded the highest economic growth in the world as a result. Our total exports grew by 60.6% to 12.7 billion United States dollars, with gold, cocoa, and crude oil accounting for 76% of those exports. Compare that to 1927, when the most progressive leader of our colonial era, Gordon Gottesberg, left our shores, and 70% of our foreign receipts were derived from the export of three raw materials: cocoa, gold, and timber. Our dependence on raw materials has in fact increased in the past century. It is this dependence that feeds our dependence on foreign aid. We cannot be doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. The social and economic vision for Africa that will ensure that Africa's growth will transform African lives is a simple one. We must add value. We must leverage our natural resources to industrialize and diversify our economies. For example, Ghana's petroleum find should not only lead us to build a petrochemical industry, but serve as a platform for an integrated industrialization campaign that links the exploitation of our iron and bauxite resources to the establishment of an integrated aluminum industry and to the significant expansion and modernization of our agricultural sector. About 30 years ago, some African nations, beginning with Ghana and Uganda, implemented liberal economic reforms to stop their economic decline. But in many cases, we opened our markets to global competition when beyond the extractive industries, we had nothing to compete with. So while the continent's share of global foreign direct investment projects has improved steadily over the past decade, much of this investment has reinforced the structural deficits of our economies. Africa is currently benefiting from growing investments from countries like China, India, and Brazil. We are inspired by the growing economic success of Brazil and India, two big democratic states from the developing world. We are all witnesses to how China's aggressive development of the market economy on the wheels of industrialization has lifted some 500 million people out of poverty over the past decade, 3 decades, creating the world's largest middle class in the process. Africa welcomes China's enthusiasm to assist with the needed credit to accelerate development on the continent. But since this is a relationship of mutual economic needs, I have raw materials, you have capital. It is the responsibility of our leaders to negotiate the best deal out there for their respective countries by leveraging these investments in the 3 critical areas: developing infrastructure, expanding manufacturing, and modernizing agriculture. Agriculture is a good example of the role the government can play in economic transformation. After less than 2 years of targeted government intervention, including the supply of fertilizer, pesticide, and improved seeds, post-conflict Sierra Leone managed to increase her rice production by 1/3, meeting and exceeding what was needed for local consumption. In this respect, Deliberate efforts to promote greater intra-African trade and investment are vital. Right now, African countries tend to produce the same products and commodities as their neighbors. Our lack of economic diversification limits the usefulness and therefore the levels of intra-African trade, since what we produce goes to and what we need comes from the world's more advanced economies. Africa's internal trade is only about 10% of its total trade, compared, for instance, to more than 60% in the European Union. The good news is that intra-African investments have witnessed a 21% compound growth from the years 2003 to 2010. More importantly, Africans investing in Africa are far more likely to invest in a diverse range of sectors. This is an indication of how focusing on an enhanced intra-regional trade agenda all across Africa can help promote economic diversification. Our continental organization, the African Union, must rise to the challenge of playing a central role in this process of social and economic transformation. It needs to take a hard look at the world around it, at the role it needs to play to be relevant, and the need to reform and revamp itself to rise to this challenge so that we can build a new Africa that is neither pawn nor victim. I would certainly prefer that North African states become full and active members of a reformed African Union. But the AU must also become capable of facing the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. The impotence of the African Union in the face of the crises that erupted in Libya and Côte d'Ivoire leaves much to be desired. A new African security architecture has to be urgently rebuilt. To that end, I believe that the AU must move away from automatic membership earned by geography and insist on strict adherence on membership eligibility based on certain fundamental democratic principles. The European Union's strict rules for membership help pull Eastern European nations through their post-Soviet transitions, and this should serve as an example to us on the continent. AU members should demonstrate a commitment to strengthening and protecting the institutions and culture of democratic governance, respecting human rights, religious freedom, and the rights of the individual and minorities, building functioning market economies, and facilitating the free movement of people, knowledge, goods, and services across member states. Africa's small countries will continue to struggle to go it alone, but the accelerated economic integration of committed nations can serve as the model for others, breathe new life into the AU, and deliver the benefits of African integration to the doorsteps of the African peoples. The AU should reflect the values of our people. 70% of people polled across African nations support democracy. Even higher numbers rejected one-party rule, military rule, and strongman rule. Recent efforts to undermine the democratic process in Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal are troubling. Attempts to remove term limits and the failure to recognize the results of legitimate elections are a pattern from which the continent must move. It is time we heard African leaders and institutions speak strongly and clearly with one voice against such retrogressive developments. In this century, we should speak with one voice, one set of common values to determine the direction of our continent. Those of you who know me also know how deeply I believe that democratic values are the only way forward for all Africans, be they North or South. I was the candidate of the ruling party in Ghana, who in the year 2008 accepted defeat in the last presidential election without demanding a recount without spilling a single drop of blood, without seeking power sharing or forcing a constitutional crisis in an election which I lost by the narrowest of margins in the history of elections in Africa. That margin was 0.46%, some 40,000 votes in a poll of some 9 million voters. I spent the previous 3 decades of my life fighting against military dictatorship and for freedom and democracy. Democracy should not be subject to individual interpretation, and it should not be a negotiation between elites and stakeholders. I was not prepared to put my personal ambition before the principles that made me a politician in the first place. Democracy is best established when institutions are trusted, the rules of the game clear, and political actors are prepared to win and lose. When Mohamed Bouazizi took his life in defiance of a system that offered him a life with no prospects, it sparked fires across North Africa and reminded those of us in the South that our own transformations have yet to be completed. The pressing challenge for all of us is how we negotiate successfully the interface between elections and democratic governance, institution building and development, poverty and economic growth and jobs, with the overriding objective being enhancing the dignity of the African, whether they be Berber, Dinka, Wolof, Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo, Ga, Akan, Shona, Zulu, Ewe, or Kikuyu. Democracy, whether in Ghana or Libya, Tunisia or Botswana, has to be seen to be delivering on 2 fundamental fronts. The electoral process must command the full confidence of voters, and elected leaders must use their mandate to serve the interests of their people. The transformation of North Africa is not going to be smooth. They will stumble, as their southern neighbors have done. They will face crises as we face crises. But we can no longer pretend that there's any other option than democracy for enhancing human dignity. I believe Africa, a united Africa of North and South, can cross this threshold of accepting democracy as the only way forward and never look back, using the stability and legitimacy gained to unleash energies to drive the transformation of the continent. There's a lot of talk that this will be the Asian century, the Chinese century. But do take it from me. The 21st century holds excellent prospects for Africa. This can be Africa's century too. We need to get Africans to believe in themselves. We must begin to see who we are as superior to what we are and where we are. This can be Africa's century, and Africans deserve leadership that can get them there. We need transformational leadership, and Africa united in the quest to build societies of opportunities and aspirations can change the landscape forever if it stays on the threshold, on the trajectory of freedom, democracy, and economic transformation. I believe fully in Africa's potential and the ability of Africans to realize it. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you so much for your eloquent defense of the principle that democratic values are genuinely universal. Thank you also for underscoring a theme that has been at the heart of the Oppenheimer Lecture since their beginning, that what Africa needs is a hand up, not a handout. Thank you also for inviting us to think of North Africa as an undivided whole of all of Africa. And thank you also for making a very dramatic policy pronouncement for the international affairs of the African continent by calling for a new African security architecture to be rebuilt, and that the African Union itself should not draw its membership uniquely from the rights conferred by geography, but from the degree to which they offer rights to their own citizens and invite a democratic commitment throughout. So we have a huge menu of things to discuss. We have time for a number of questions, and could I ask people to seek the floor, and I will invite a microphone to come your way. Why don't we begin with Africa Confidential here, right out in the open? If you could ask the first question.
I like the idea of the open.
Thanks for making me less confidential. It's Patrick Smith. I'm really intrigued to hear what you had to say about the African Union. As you point out, the African Union was pretty much sidelined in the big international interventions last year in La Côte d'Ivoire and Libya. I wondered if you could tell us what you would have done differently if you'd been president. What would you have pressed the African Union to do to make itself more central to these interventions, which were, in name at least, to support the democratic currents? And what would you do now, as you say, to the worrying threat in Senegal and perhaps in Zimbabwe of electoral violence coming up this year?
The question of what I would have done if I'd been there, it's a hypothetical matter, and it's a little bit, you know, the horse is already out of. But I believe what I'm trying to say is this: is that if there is a common set of values that all of us subscribe to within the Union, when issues come up like they did in Côte d'Ivoire and in Libya, it will be relatively easy for us to speak with one voice. The difficulty, for instance, in the Libyan matter was that there were so many people who had to make decisions who were beholden to the person who was responsible for the Libyan crisis in the first place, Muammar Gaddafi, and therefore found it extremely difficult to advocate for any robust response to the crisis. I don't think that situation would occur if the Union was very clear in its mind about the values that underlay it. It is that absence. I mean, the AU Charter talks a great deal about the need for good governance, for democracy, etc. But nevertheless, accommodated countries that were clearly not democratic countries, where good governance was not being implemented. So the first thing is that this set of values that around which we forge the Union, if we're clear about it, when something like what happened in Libya is concerned, we may not have the physical power to be able to impact, like, say, NATO did in resolve, but at least we will be in a position to speak so forcefully and clearly that it will be difficult for the world to deal with the issue without taking our views into account. The same happened in La Côte d'Ivoire. All of us who are neighbors of La Côte d'Ivoire were aware from the beginning that Laurent Gbagbo, I mean, I always was of the view that he could never win an election in Côte d'Ivoire. The arithmetic on the ground was never on his side. But once again, as a result of these internal interest conflicts within ECOWAS, for instance, as a beginning, ECOWAS was not able to state with clarity and forcefully, this is what has happened. We accept that Alassane Ouattara won the election. And all of us are saying, without equivocation, Laurent Gbagbo, hand over peacefully. I think if he had been met with that sort of united position within ECOWAS and then within the African Union, because even within the African Union, there were countries like Angola that were through the back door and others attempting to feed him the wherewithal to continue his defiance. Those are the matters that we can clear. Building our military capacity, those things are going to take time. Our economies have to prosper and give us the opportunity to do that. But at the diplomatic and political level, if we are clear about the values that bind all of us, it will be much easier for us to impact those situations. And I'm saying the same. I mean, I have yet to hear anybody condemning openly what clearly is going on in Senegal, which is a man who came to power as a Democrat and now transformed himself into a leader who's going to stay there forever. I mean, and yet, we're finding it difficult to say what is the obvious position. And therefore, when the violence occurs, which I'm hoping all of us are praying to God will not happen in Senegal, Senegal's credentials as a democratic state has been an inspiration to hundreds of millions across the continent. Hopefully, it will not occur. But if it does, I believe once again it is time for our leaders to stand up and speak and say, these kind of developments are not just on.
Thank you very much. Yes, you, sir, if you could stand up and give us your name and affiliation if relevant. Thank you.
My name is Nanaya Onyantechi. I'm a student. Too often what is said about the international community's response to chaotic situations around the world is too little, too late. And in Ghana at the moment, there's every incentive for the ruling government to distort and alter the outcomes of the next election. And one of the incentives is that within 3 years, 667 million Ghana cedis have been paid fraudulently to some people. And I think in order to avoid the potential investigation by an incoming MPP government, there's that incentive for them to alter and distort the outcome of the elections. Now, what do you think the international community can and should do to stop this from happening? For instance, in the case of the payment of the judgment debt, do you think the international community should withhold any further funding to Ghana as a form of pressure to bear on the current administration?
There are two more hypothetical questions already, so why don't you take those two?
Charity, they say, begins at home. And the issues you're talking about are matters that, first of all, the Ghanaian people have to pronounce themselves on. We have to come to grips with our electoral system and with governments that will attempt to manipulate or distort them. We have to make it clear that we will not go down that road, and that a government that attempts it will not meet with our approval. I mean, before the international community can come in on any issue, we ourselves must try to deal with our own matters. The payments of the monies that you're talking about, these are strictly domestic issues in Ghana. And I believe the institutions of our country are quite capable, if they want to deal with this issue. And that is the first place we have to look at, the institutions of our country.
So yes, you, sir, in the third row, and I'll come to the second row next.
My name is Alulu. I'm a student. During your speech, you made mention of China predominance in Africa, and what maybe we could do is leverage our resources and, in effect, for them to develop our infrastructure and industrialization. I was thinking if it's the best approach for we to leverage our natural resources and for we to leverage our natural resources for them to give us those things back. Why can't we Africans build on our own industrialization? Like kind of copy, you made mention of like African Union and European Union. Do what like European Union do. We can develop our own industrialization. Export, that will give us more income rather than leveraging our natural resources to China.
Okay, we got it.
My response is really, I don't know any country in the world, including the United States of America, that has been able to finance 100% its own industrial development. Everybody has depended to some extent, at some stage, China itself, on mobilizing foreign savings to support your economic growth and development. And I'm saying that I don't think that we in Africa are going to be any different. Foreign investment is going to continue to come to our continent. But what we need to do is to try and put a perspective on the kind of foreign investment that we believe is useful for us. For instance, I don't see the value of Ghana switching destinations in the export of its raw cocoa. We have been traditionally selling them in the markets of the West. Now going to sell them to China or India doesn't really change the nature of our economy. And that is the change that we have to be seeking. So it is that trade-off that I think that we have to look at. If somebody is coming to say, yes, I have money, I have capital, I have technology, I have skill, I want to come and play these out in your country, you have also to have a perspective on what you hope to gain from it. And the main things that we're looking for to drive our development is expanding rapidly our infrastructure, creating much more manufacturing capability on the continent, forward for bringing prosperity to our people. We're not going to be able to develop our continent in isolation from the rest of the world. Nobody's been able to do it. China had to open up before the developments that we're seeing are happening. The same thing is going to happen to us. But what we need to do is to have a plan and a program which allows that intervention to fit into our own objectives. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Just before I bring in the last question, could I ask you one of my own, insofar as the theme has been the impact of the Arab Spring on African politics? You ran a campaign in 2008, you're running a campaign now in 2012. In what sense is the way in which you address the Ghanaian people in this campaign affected by the reality of the Arab Spring and the psychological impact that it has brought to the nature of politics on the continent?
I think two very obvious ones for me. One, the absolute preeminence in the campaign, at least in my message, about creating jobs for our young people. Because that is a critical issue in Ghana today, all over our country. Towns and villages you go to, groups of able-bodied young men and women standing, playing Ghanaian games, and not working. And clearly, that's the material out of which Mohamed Bouazizi comes from. That is a matter that we need to deal with head on. And then, of course, as a corollary to that, education. So the emphasis that we're making on education and on jobs, I would say some of it is directly affected by the events that have taken place in North Africa.
And the last question is you, sir, with the red and black tie, if you stand up.
Very, very famous veteran journalist.
Excellent.
In Ghana, Cameron Dodo.
Thank you very much. Cameron Dodo, New African. I know that my profession bears a lot of responsibility for shorthanding this Arab Spring business. But wouldn't you accept that, in fact, perhaps we are putting the cart before the horse? If you look at what happened in Cote d'Ivoire in 2000, when the people chased General Guerre out of Cote d'Ivoire because he wanted to change the result of the election. If you come to Nigeria and look at the struggle that the people put up against General Abacha, the heroic deaths of people like Ken Saro-Wiwa, we didn't have 24-hour television in Cote d'Ivoire or Nigeria. But that doesn't change the fact that these things happened. And I think perhaps there's a little bit of a falsification of history when it is pretended that the Arab Spring is actually the mother of democratic movement in Africa, whereas they've been going hand in hand. And probably what happened in Black Africa had a far greater effect on the future of the continent than the unconcluded as yet Arab Spring.
I think I don't have to respond to that.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I know that there are many other questions, but unfortunately the candidate and his party need to leave to another obligation in a second. Could I thank you very much for delivering this 2012 Oppenheimer Lecture. It's been webcast, and so I know a lot of people who weren't able to be present in this room will have watched it live. Others can study it more carefully at their leisure. We will post the formal remarks that you delivered on our webpage soon. Thank you very much for bringing together these difficult issues for us again.